Okay.
It is working, and so we're good to go.
Okay, so what I think we're gonna do kind of trade off on
Sure,
which
sure. Yeah, do it whatever
stories
way
and
you want.
tell us when you're turned on.
Yeah, we're rolling right now.
Okay.
And so, and again, this will be just for our documentation.
Sure, sure, sure.
And we'll most likely transcribe this in the future, depending on funding, and we'll definitely give you a copy of
Oh, that'd
this.
be nice. Yeah.
So I'll just start off by saying we're very happy and grateful to the artist Yi Jian Bao for welcoming us into his home and studio. Today is Saturday, September 15th, 2012, and it's about a few minutes after 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And I, Mark Johnson, professor from San Francisco State University, is are here with.
Stephen Wong, the curator at the Chinese American Museum in Los Angeles.
So, what we'd like to do is to talk with you about your life and your work, and we know a little bit about your biography, but not very much. So, we hope that you can share some of your autobiography with us, including when and where you were born, and a little bit about that community, and how long you lived there, and maybe we'll start with that.
Yeah. I was born in Shanghai, China, during the revolution. The communist takeover, and when the communists came in, we went to Hong Kong. We emigrated. And when I was 5, my parents moved to Uruguay, uh, in part because they had open immigration. It's one of the few countries that accepted anyone. And one of the reasons we went there is because the weather is good, and the political situation was stable. It was a democracy. So that was in 1951, when I was 5 years old, and I started private school there. First grade, second grade. With the students were some were British, some were Americans. There were some Uruguayans, so it was a very mixed group.
And were there many Chinese immigrants that also moved to Uruguay?
There was, it was interesting. There was something like 10 families that came in at the same time. And because there were so few, we all knew each other. And one of the families moved in about 2 blocks from us. And one of their sons and I, became friends, and we're still best friends to this day. And he lives in Boston with his family.
And can you talk a little bit about what life was like in Uruguay when you were a young guy?
Of course. Well, I was going to school, and, we lived in a certain upscale community. So we did a few things in what I thought was the center of Montevideo. And then when I was in college and came back, I discovered that that particular area was where some of the wealthy kids went, but it wasn't the center of the city at all. And so then I realized my experience in growing up was a little bit limited, because my friends took me to another place where the Uruguayans went, and that was the real center of Montevideo,
Yeah.
not where my experience was.
So your family was a little bit upwardly mobile.
Yes, definitely.
And can you say what kind of business they were involved with, or?
Well, my dad was in the pharmaceutical business in Shanghai, China, and he was one of the first capitalists that industrialized. He bought machines from the United States. and he made a lot of money during the Second World War because of the British effort in Southeast Asia. And what happened was these airplanes full of medicine will take off to Burma and all those, Thailand, where the fighting was occurring. And when they would leave the airport, they would get shot down. So then, you need another supply of medicine. And that's how he made his money during the war.
And were you always interested in art, even as a child?
No. I mean, I was interested in cartoons and comic books. But I got interested in art in boarding school when I was in England. I met some British kids, classmates, that were very good draftsmen. So they said, well, why don't you join the art class? I said, well, because I don't know how to draw. They said, well, it's not that hard. And that's how I got started.
And when did you move from Uruguay to England?
I think well, first I went to boarding school in the United States when I was 14.
Okay.
Then when I was 16, I went to England and finished there.
So when you were 14, what city did you move to in the United States?
Well, I flew into New York and the boarding school was in New Jersey. And I was there for 1 year only.
And decided you didn't like it, and then...
I think my parents decided that, and I had a schoolmate from Uruguay that was in this boarding school, and their parents thought it was a better school, so I went there. But it wasn't my decision, I just got farmed there. But as it turns out, it was I liked it better there, the British system. Because the American system was based on tests, quizzes. And the British system, they never did that. You had your A-level exams, but to prepare you, they made you write essays. You never were tested. So it was very interesting.
And where was the boarding school in England?
It was in Ramsgate, Kent. Right on the water.
Could I
Sure.
actually take a step back? So you immigrated from Hong Kong to Uruguay
Yes.
when you're 5. When you growing up, was it a bilingual household, a trilingual household? What were you speaking with your friends versus what were you speaking with your family?
Yeah, well, the family, it was Chinese, Shanghai dialect. And I learned Spanish and English together in school. So it was, I had Uruguayan friends, so that was all in Spanish. And then at school, it was mostly in English.
Have you retained any of that? Are you trilingual still today?
Well, yes, except every year I lose my Chinese more and more because, I don't practice it anymore. But Spanish and, English are more standard.
And just really quick, and we'll continue to move forward, but when your family, you said your father made money in pharmaceuticals?
Yes.
And did he continue that trade? Did your family stay in pharmaceuticals in Uruguay?
Well, he kind of retired,
Oh.
but he did fund a company that was pharmaceutical that was run by a Chinese man.
So fast forward back to boarding school.
Yes.
You spent the rest of the remaining of your high school years in England?
Well, yeah, I was actually there for 2 years. I didn't finish high school because what happened was I applied to college and the American colleges, all they wanted to know was your ranking, where you stood in your class. And so In England, they don't do it quite that way. So the dean there called me in, and he said, "I don't know what to do. Do you have any ideas? They want to where you stand in our class. We don't rank our students." And he said, "What are you interested in?" And I said, "Art." So he says, "Do you mind if I go to your drawing teacher and ask him where you stood?" And I said, "No, go ahead." And we were a class of 7 in our drawing class. And because I just joined the class, he ranked me 7th. But in the report, I was 7th in the whole school. So I got into college without finishing high school through this little bureaucratic error.
Good story. And where did you go to college?
To Grinnell College in Iowa.
Which is a very famous progressive school.
Well, yeah, it has a high academic ranking, but when I arrived there, it was full of Republicans, and it was really full of students that couldn't get into Harvard, so they were a little bit angry about that, because they were in Iowa. And then, of course, 3 years later was the Vietnam War, so all these Republicans started smoking pot and being anti-war, and it was really quite an interesting era because you saw their transformation.
Yeah.
First they were for Goldwater, and then they were hippies.
And what year did you move to Grinnell?
64.
64. And were you an art major?
Yes.
Do you have any good memories of education at Grinnell and studio art?
Well, yeah. I mean, I had a painting teacher that I thought was good, but he was a little bit weird because no matter what you did, he would say, "Oh, that's great." So he wouldn't actually give you a critique. So he would walk in, he'd look at anybody's work, and he said, "Oh, that's wonderful." Some other student would show him paint. "Oh, beautiful." He was, it was like, he was an interesting guy because he wasn't really teaching. And so as I look back, he was very encouraging, but I didn't know what I was doing, and he didn't bother me.
When you came to the United States, you were not an American citizen.
No.
So you were part of the draft and all of that stuff.
Well, what happened was I was in graduate school, and I knew I didn't want to go home. But I couldn't get to stay because in those years when you finish school, you have to leave. So one of my graduate school teachers decided to adopt me. But then he found out his lawyer told him he couldn't because his income wasn't high enough. But the lawyer said, what he could do is get married to an American and get a citizenship that way. And so one summer day, I wasn't dating any American students. So one summer day, this grad student and I went to get ice cream. There was a long line. It was very hot. And when we got to our spot, this girl cut in front of us and ordered her ice cream. So I kind of got miffed. And my friend says, "No, Jen, she's beautiful, So when she got her ice cream, he asked her out, and he kept pursuing her, and she kept saying no. So we all sat down together. And finally, my friend says, "Oh, I give up. You should marry him because they're going to deport him." So she passed on a yellow notebook and says, "Write your last name." So I wrote B-A-O. And she wrote her first name, and it was Billy. And she says, "Billy Bao, I like that. I'll marry you." So we started going to LA to file immigration papers, get a blood test for the marriage. And then we got the school chaplain to agree. And on the day of the wedding, all my friends were giggling through the ceremony. And the chaplain stopped it, and he says, "This is a big farce." you're not seriously getting married. Of course we weren't, it was just a arrangement. So I took him aside and I said, look, my friends are drunk, they're having a good time, but we're very serious. And so he did it. And then she filed immigration papers for me to get my green card. And I got drafted. The first thing you had to do was to go to a draft board. And I drew, in those years, you draw numbers. And I drew something like the number 223, which got me out of the draft.
Lucky, yeah.
Yeah, it was just chance because all my friends were saying, look, you're Asian. In Vietnam, they're going to put you down a tunnel. You're the first one to go in. They're going to shoot you right away, the Viet Cong.
Yeah, I was number 113, so I could relate to the whole period of when you got a number assigned to you because of the lottery.
It was strictly a lottery. I didn't even think about it. I went to a lottery and
Yeah.
they said, oh,
And so you went to graduate school in Southern California
yes,
at
Claremont.
which campus was it?
Well, it was weird because they have 5 colleges, so you could study at any of the teachers at any college. So it was Pomona, Scripps, Claremont Men's. And there was a lot of art teachers at Scripps and Pomona. And I think there was one art teacher in Pitzer. And so, all the teachers were split up. It was a strange graduate program because you just went to these teachers and say, can I take a course from you? And they would always say yes.
So was that 1968 that you started there?
68, yeah.
Are there any influences in terms of people you studied under, either in undergrad or your graduate school?
Well, no, because at that time I hadn't developed yet. I was sort of, I was trying to sort of find my own way, but I think that happened a little bit later. And the teachers were helpful in the sense that they were, very pleasant. But I really don't remember an influence.
Do you remember looking at any artists in grad school? Any influential?
Oh, yeah. At that time, at that time it was very specific because if you were in painting, all our teachers were in favor of Frank Stella and Bryce Martin and Larry Poons with the polka dots. And they were trying to tell us that in New York, the artists were very mathematical and very controlled, very anti-intuitive. And so we were led to believe that we had to follow this mainstream. But it's very hard to do because, we ended up with a Bryce Martin and you're looking at a great painting with nothing in it. So how do you take that one step further? But that's what we all believed in, that American art was a train and there was progress, and our job was to take it one step further. And of course, I couldn't do anything because of Bryce Martin, where do you go with this minimalism?
There's a very famous quote from Willem de Kooning.
Yes.
And he said, modern art is a train, just like you said. And one of the things that I always thought was interesting about his quote is he said it starts in Mesopotamia, but it never went through Asia.
What?
In this quote
Yeah.
from just how we got to modern art.
I see.
And so I'm wondering, are there, because obviously your art education in England and Grinnell and Los Angeles was a Euro-American tradition?
Well, yeah. I was always interested in everything, and also Asian painting, although, that wasn't taught in school.
Yeah.
But I was looking at a lot of it through books and shows and that kind of thing.
So like ancient Chinese painting kind of stuff?
Absolutely. And Japanese. Chinese and Japanese. And to me, it was very interesting, the landscapes. But you know, at the same time, I was looking at contemporary art. I was looking at everything really. And what happened is when I went to, my first job was University of Texas,
So you graduated 1970 with an MFA?
71, because I
71.
stayed a year longer because of this marriage thing. You know,
But you and Billy never actually lived together.
no,
Yeah. But then you got a teaching job as a part-time teacher?
no. At that time, it was easy to get a full-time job, so I started as an instructor at University of Texas
In Austin?
in Austin.
Yeah.
But I was very isolated because all the teachers were in their 50s or 60s, and they're very, very conservative. And I was the only young person, so it was a difficult time in the sense that I didn't have my graduate school friends to talk to, and I didn't have young instructors to talk to. But it was good for me in one sense because it forced me to make art that was a little bit more unique. You know, because I was away from New York, away from LA. And I started this group of paintings in which I would quote, or I would actually paint little passages of paintings I liked. So it's like a blackboard with different quotations of art. And, you know, without knowing what I was doing, it was very aligned with postmodern art, but it was way before that. So I just made what do you call it, a history of my interests. And then something weird happened is we had a famous photographer called Gary Winogrand. I don't know if you've ever heard of it,
Yes.
in the faculty. And he came to me and he said, you know, you're the best painter here in this department. And I said, well, thank you. He says, yeah, but it's not a big deal because they're all awful. And what's wrong with your work, although it's very interesting, is that you haven't yet found the subject. You know, your subject is other art, but that's not yours. You know, you're quoting other artists, and it's all very clever, but you're missing something. And so I started hanging around him, and he taught me photography. I actually photographed with him for 3 years, stopped painting. And I remember he had a show in Houston, and he had 300 photographs, and I was in a lot of his photographs in the background, holding a camera, wondering what to photograph, and there I was as a backdrop of one of his photographs. But he was a really interesting teacher because he didn't go to school, you know, he was self-educated. And what was interesting about him was he was very anti-academic. You know, he was very insulted by all these other academics. And he got into arguments with them. And he had to prove that he was smarter than they were, and possibly he was. So he gave me an education that was so different from graduate school. You know, because he was hostile to this way I was taught. But you know, I'll make it interesting for you guys. My main influence has been people that I met through my journey. And beginning with Gary, I felt like he was my first teacher. And at the same time that I met Gary, there was a teacher in Austin, art historian from Yale, called Tommy Rees. And he was my first colleague. And what he would do to me was that he would come to my studio once a month. He was an art historian, and he would always come at 8 with an overlarge pizza and a six-pack beer. And he would say, Yi-Jan, I just came from research in the library. I hope you don't mind if I eat this. I said, no. I mean, I was so thrilled that somebody from Yale was coming because I didn't know anything, you know. I thought Yale was a good school. And so I would bring out a painting and he'd be eating his pizza and he would say, oh, that's really great. It's very delicious. And I got confused. Is he talking about my work or the pizza? So I'll bring out another painting and he says, scrumptious, beautiful, gorgeous, gorgeous background. And he would be eating this pizza. So I was really happy that somebody liked all my work, but I was confused because he was always eating this pizza. And then I moved to South Austin, and he never came again, so I thought he dumped me. And one day his wife called me and says, oh, Tommy's getting tenure. I asked him which studio person to invite. He says, invite Yi-Jan, he's the only one I like. So I realized he didn't dump me, so I went to his party. And his wife said, I don't know what's wrong with Tommy. He's been on a diet for a year and he hasn't lost a pound. All he eats is carrots. And then I remember my home was half a block from the most famous pizza store in Austin. So he would call me and come over, and I'm sure he found somebody else, you know, some grad student, somebody else to do that with. And then he became assistant director of the Getty. This is 10, 15 years later. I ran into him in New York. And he had remarried. He was with his second wife who didn't care about his weight. And we went to a restaurant and he told his wife, you know, Yi-Jan is a great painter. His backgrounds are so delicious. So again, I was mortified. You know, I know he loved me, but why? Was it the pizza or me? You know, so it caused a lot of doubt in my mind. But he was an influence because he was so high on my work, but in a non-theoretical way.
Did you exhibit in Texas?
Not really. I didn't have any exhibits. Because at that time, Austin didn't really have galleries. And what I was doing, the art department perceived as anti-art. So they were getting ready to fire me for my work. You know, which they eventually did. I mean, they, you know, I didn't get tenure. So the very next year, I got a job at RISD.
So this would have been in the mid-70s.
Right. And so RISD was the best art school. So it caused a lot of confusion in my school because they just hired me, but I was going actually to a better school. And at RISD, when they interviewed me, they said, why are you leaving Texas? And I said, oh, they fired me. And that whole group at RISD started laughing. And I said, well, what's so funny? And they said, you know, there were 300 applicants. You were the only applicant we really liked. Those dummies at Texas didn't know what they were doing. So that was a thrill. I didn't know that I was good, you know. And it was a visiting, rotating job for 2 years. And when I was there, it was very interesting because the students were doing interesting work. You know, so their reputation did have a little bit of merit. You know, I had a lot of interesting students.
Where did you live when you were teaching there?
I lived in off Hope Street in a street called Larch. Hope was the main street that ran down the east side.
In Providence.
In Providence, yeah. Yeah, RISD was called the east side. You went up a hill. It was RISD, and Brown was right next to it.
And so were you able to start showing your work there?
No, I didn't show. I was doing some work.
Were there interesting colleagues at RISD?
Oh, absolutely. the that group, it was fascinating because they were all older. They were in their 60s, and they were all unique painters, and none of them were influenced by New York. So it was mainly a strange kind of figurative work, but they were very good painters and very, I thought, very smart people. You know, they went to RISD, studied with one man that they worshipped, and then started, you know, teaching there. So it's an interesting group. Uh, and generally speaking, I liked them a lot.
So you were there until the later 70s.
Yes.
And
Well, when my job expired, I started applying to other jobs. One of the schools that offered me a job was actually Yale. But when I went there for my interview, the way they did it is you have to give graduate school critiques to the graduate students. And I was doing it at the same time as one of the teachers, what was his name? I think Bailey, William Bailey, painted eggs. And he would go into a studio and scream at the students. And when I would walk in, he would leave and his face would be red. And I walk in and the student would be crying because I followed him. And after a whole day of doing this, you know, meeting crying students, I realized I can't teach here. You know, this style of making people cry is absurd. So they called me in and they offered me a job, and I said, I'm sorry, I can't do it. And they said, why? You know, we're Yale, we're the best. And I didn't know what to say to them. You know, I just didn't like the vibes. But I didn't want to tell them they were bad, so instead, I did a very dumb thing. I went to University of Oklahoma, where there were much nicer people, but you know, it was very empty. You know, the students were not interested, the teachers were not interested. So for me, it was a large vacuum. And after a couple of years, they tenured me, and as soon as I got tenure, I quit. You know, I realized I couldn't stay there.
so this is now mid 80s.
Right. So then I went to Stony Brook in New York, in Long Island. And that was a very difficult job, too. You know, because I didn't last long there. You know, I hated the people and the environment. And so then I went to see a shrink, and I explained to him everything. And he said, well, he says, you're in a tenure track job that you hate. Why don't you quit? And I said, well, because it's hard to find a tenure track job. And he says, yeah, but you're unhappy. So he says, if I were you, I'd quit. And you have some ambitions to be a painter, so just become part-time. You know, don't take a tenure track job. You know, that's not for you. And so I took his advice, and I went to Chicago and started teaching part-time there, and was much happier. You know, because as part-time, you're less involved with the faculty and meetings.
At what school in Chicago?
The Chicago Art Institute.
So these are some of the schools that you mentioned are among the most highly regarded art schools in the United States.
Yes.
And so I think for Steve and I, we're thinking, you know, you've had an incredible career with these major schools, and yet we would think that you would need to have a big profile in a New York gallery to be invited to teach at some of those very prestigious schools.
Well, I think I tried, but I kept getting rejected.
So was it just on the strength of your work that they saw in slides and the fact that you had teaching experience that you could go to Chicago and get part-time work at the Art Institute of Chicago, you think?
Well, in Chicago, at that time, there was a very powerful dean. And when I was at Stony Brook, RISD was doing a 5-year review of their painting program. And they had liked me, so they put me in this panel with this dean. So I spent 5 days reviewing their painting program. And so when I went to Chicago, he already knew me, and he got me the job on top of the art department. And of course, you know, that created a small problem. But he was very powerful, so, you know, there I was. And a very interesting thing happened in Chicago to me. I had a very old friend from Texas, a married couple. But when I was in Chicago, I saw them again, and the wife asked me for a monkey painting. And, you know, here I was trying to be a contemporary artist. And the idea of just painting a monkey didn't quite fit with my idea of being a avant-garde artist. But she was a very close friend, and she said, you know, I really love monkeys, and I love the way you paint. Can you paint me a monkey? So on the side, I did a little monkey painting. And it came out so good that I didn't tell her. I kept it. You know, it was just a secret. So a year later, she asked me for a monkey painting, and I said, oh, I haven't done it, I'm very busy. And that Christmas, her husband and I and a group of friends went out to Chinatown for dinner. And in the menus, they have an astrology. And at dinner, we discovered everybody in the whole table was a monkey, except for me. And she said, where's my monkey painting? Then I felt a little bit guilty, so I started doing monkeys, one after another. And I realized I connected with the subject that Gary Winogrand was telling me. You know, you need to find a subject. But when I painted the monkey, I connected psychologically to the monkey. So it was the first time that I encountered a content in painting that related to me. So I ended up doing 80 monkey paintings, found a Chicago gallery that eventually they sold them all. But that wasn't the interesting part. The interesting part is this woman, Frances Judd, had connected me to something very real. And when I was done with that series, I went to her for another idea because her last idea was a gold mine, you know, financially and otherwise. So I went to her home and I said, look, Frances, your last idea was a gold mine. Can you give me another one? And she says, no, I can't, because the only reason I want monkey paintings is because I like them. So her husband was making salsa in the kitchen. He came out with a salsa bowl, and he says, I have an idea. He says, Yi-Jan, you should paint cars. I said, cars? Why cars? He says, well, the whole American industry is based on cars. You buy cars, you sell them. You know, there are these giant wreckage places where you store old cars, you know, the salvage business. He says, the critics are going to have a field day with you. So I said, well, okay. So I started painting cars. And, you know, it was a very weird thing because I didn't have any psychological connection to this. So after 20, 30 paintings, I stopped painting cars. But my gallery sold them all. You know, it was a very popular thing. And then I realized that this couple was a gold mine. No matter what they came out with, it sold out. So I drove to their house and I said, look, John, I'm tired of cars. Can you give me another idea? And he said, no, I just happen to like cars, that's all. So that was it. But I was on my way. I felt I'm becoming an artist because I discovered a content.
Did you know Michiko Itatani?
I did.
Other friends from the Art Institute?
I was only friends with the dean.
And Who was that?
Martin Prekop.
Yeah.
There was a lot of painters, but at that time at the Art Institute, they were all into abstract painting, and I was painting monkeys. So, you know, they felt I wasn't making art. I felt they weren't making art. You know, so there was a little gap there.
Yeah. And when we look at your work today, it's your work typically has some representational element,
Yes,
but there's also this big sort of veil
yes,
that relates maybe to Morris Lewis, or this kind of, you know, skein of color that's completely not objective and abstract.
right.
And when did that develop in your work?
I think when I moved to the Bay Area, I started painting atmospheres. So it was a little bit like Morris Lewis, a little bit like Rothko. But I was really influenced more by Turner and his atmospheric paintings. And the late Turner paintings are really wild. I mean, they're totally abstract, very chaotic. And to me, they were very radical for his time. But I didn't want to do a Turner, you know. So I started putting people and boats and different subjects into this atmosphere. And my interest at that moment was, how do I paint an object by removing all its weight? You know, I wanted a figure that was weightless. And they were kind of floating in this atmosphere, which I call a no zone. They were in nowhere land. Maybe they're a little bit lost. Who knows? And I was compelled to do this for, I think, the 6 or 7 years I've been here.
So you're in Chicago from the late 80s into the early 90s?
Yes.
So how many years total in Chicago?
I forget, but it was like maybe 6 or 7.
And then you came from Chicago to the Bay Area? Or was there something between?
I think I went to residencies for a year. I took a year off. No, I went back to RISD for a year. For 2 years. They had the same job I had before, except with a whole new crowd of young people. And the young people hired me because they heard about me from the old people. So it was very weird because I didn't know this group. And because I had a little bit of conflict in Chicago with the abstract artists, when I left, I said, look, I'm leaving for a real art school, you know, just to rub it in a little bit. So I was there for 2 years. After that, when that job ended, I went to residencies for a year. And I think my second year, I went to a few residencies. But by that time, I wasn't really interested in teaching, but I needed an income. And at the last minute, I applied, and I got this job at this university called Clarion, which is in Appalachia. And it was a terrible school, terrible environment. But it was very near Pittsburgh, where Martin Prekop became dean of Carnegie Mellon. So I was in Pittsburgh a lot. And then I quit that job and moved. My brother lives in the Bay Area, and he asked me to move. He found me an apartment in Alameda, so I moved without a job. And when I was out here, Steve Beal, at that time, when I was in Chicago, he was one of the assistant deans. He became a provost here, so he hired me here at CCA.
And you moved here to the Bay Area in about 2002, 2003, or 2004. Yeah.
maybe 2004, because I've been here 7, 8 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, 2004.
So you've moved around what I would call quite a bit.
A lot,
I've moved around a lot.
a lot.
And can you talk about why you, was it just because of the jobs, or do you enjoy traveling and seeing different parts of the
No,
country?
I think in my mind I was looking for an ideal school. And after a while I realized that didn't exist. And then second of all, I realized that I really wasn't an academic type. So I was looking for a fit, but I couldn't fit in any of these places because my orientation isn't very academic. So when I was at CCA, I knew all this. I knew that there was no ideal school. I knew that didn't belong anywhere really. And I also knew I didn't belong in schools. But I had to make a living. And to me, it was very interesting because the only part of CCA I was involved with was with my classes. And so I had a lot of interesting students. And because of the CCA structure, they would only give me freshman students, because they kept the advanced courses for themselves. And, because of my work, they decided I wasn't, I don't know, contemporary enough or something. So they gave me the freshman classes only. And that was very interesting to me because I realized that they were a lot of fun, the freshmen. And gradually, the longer I was here and there, they would give me an advanced course. And I realized I didn't enjoy those courses as much as the freshmen.
And you're also a professor of diversity studies.
Oh, that was very interesting.
And can you talk about what that is about?
Oh, absolutely. Because, because I came from South America, I was a little bit involved with the boom movement, Vargas Llosa, Julio Cortázar. I think Gabriel Marquez was part of it, with magic realism. And in that course, what I tried to do was teach all the people I loved, from literature like Borges to film. So I showed a lot of Chinese, Japanese movies, and a lot of visual art that I liked. So it was a course about all the cultures that had influenced me that were non-Western. And here and there, I would show a Western film that dealt with the other. And that course was a real success from the point of view of the students because I wasn't trying to convert them. What I told them it's true that I said it's true that you are who you are, but it's also true that you're affected by what you see. And what I'm going to show you is stuff that you haven't seen before that hopefully will influence you because it's so great, so beautiful. So instead of talking about diversity, I show them great works of art. And then, of course, these works of art had a content that was social and political, and we would end up talking about it in a more natural manner, if that makes any sense.
That makes great sense.
Yeah, so it was really a fun course and a big, it brought a lot of happiness to the students and to me. Because they couldn't wait to come and see another movie. And it was a seminar, so I was able to try to get people to talk, which is a little bit difficult nowadays. I don't know if you know this, but the contemporary student has a harder time talking in class. And especially some of the Asian students are more shy and they just don't want to talk in class. But I was able to find a way to get them to talk.
It's interesting how you've incorporated your life experiences and your interests into a class. How does your past, how does your background, how does your transnationalism, or does it inform your work and how
Well, it does in the sense that because I travel and because I had different backgrounds, I think I was exposed to a lot of things like literature and painting and people uh, that that changed me. So I feel that my painting is in part about these things, about all the great things I've seen, and I feel that although it's about the figures, about faces, is about a certain kind of emotional content. It's also about the history of these people I've looked at. So I feel a painter always is making commentary on the people that have influenced them, the painters. At the same time that he's pursuing his own track. So when I look at my work, I see other art in it.
And so we've talked about a few of them, but if I see a racehorse, I think of also the Degas, and some of these faces are hard to place because they're so distinctive and original and unlike anybody else's that I can think of.
Well, they came about from Polaroids of my students. And as I started my Asian students, and as I started working on them, they changed, and I sort of created another face that didn't look like theirs. And to me, it's just a vehicle to convey certain emotional expressions. They're hard to categorize because a lot of them look stunned or surprised or in fear or in terror. And so for me, it's a conveyor of various emotional things. Yet, they're presented formally with a trace of minimalism and contemporary abstract art. So there are tropes of various art in it. But, I do think of Degas and Pinkham Ryder and Goya and Rembrandt.
So I know people don't generally think of themselves in terms of their context, but do you consider yourself principally an American artist?
No, I think what I'm trying to do is become a good painter. So I suppose it's American because I live here, but I don't think of it that way. As a painter, what you really want is a better painting. And you keep doing it because you always think you missed the boat. So it makes you do another one. So it's a little bit like chasing something that doesn't exist.
Exactly.
you mentioned that this recent body of work that they're from Polaroids of your students, but you also said Asian students. Why just the Asian students?
It's an interesting question. The Asian students at CCA come from Taiwan, from Korea, from mainland China, and also from America. But they're very distinct groups. The American-born Chinese students very different from the mainland Chinese. The mainland Chinese is somewhat different from Taiwan and Hong Kong. So for me, they were an interesting group because they were a little bit out of context with CCA. And I felt that way my whole life, that no matter where I lived, I didn't quite belong. And, of course, I spent a lot of time in Chinatown at the restaurants. So for me, the Asian students are interesting because I would ask them, which restaurant should I go to? because the Taiwan students like Taiwan food, and Hong Kong students like Hong Kong food, and so forth. So I think that's where it comes from. And and generally speaking, it's because I want to help them because they're struggling with art school, having difficulty socially and academically. And generally speaking, it's out of trying to help them because I experienced the same sort of difficulty. But with American students too, the same thing. A lot of students, American students, come to art school because they want to be significant. But in art school, there's so many interested students, it's very hard to be significant. Because you always find somebody more talented, some student the teachers like better because, they're hipper. So there's a lot of lost people that are struggling to gain significance. And I find that very interesting, that situation, because they're looking for a place to be, which is what I've been looking for all my life and haven't found it.
So it's a very beautiful interview. We're coming close to almost an hour. I just wanted to also say you're a very humble man. We know you've won Guggenheim fellowships and other prestigious awards. We didn't talk about any of that today. I just thought I'd ask how winning a Guggenheim might have changed your career.
Well, it was very strange because I was a little bit young when I won it, because I was told you got to apply for it several times. And I applied for it once and got it. So I didn't know what to do with it because at that time, I hadn't found the monkeys. I hadn't found my way. And generally speaking, I didn't believe in what I was doing. But here I was with this famous grad. And what I did was I got drunk for a whole year with the money. So it was kind of a disaster. Because people asked me, what'd you do with the Guggenheim? And I said, I got drunk. So it was a little bit a waste of money. However, when I was in one of the residencies, I met the president of the Guggenheim, who was a poet. His name was Joel Conroe. And I told him that I won the Guggenheim once, and he said, no way. I don't know why he said that. I said, well, okay. And the next day, he came to me and said he called his office and found out that indeed I had one. Could he see my work? And I said, absolutely not. But later on, we became friends. And I visited the foundation and found out that the person in charge of art sat in the meeting where I won the Guggenheim. And she told me that Motherwell had liked my work. And was I a friend of Motherwell's? I said, no, I never met him my whole life. And then I found out that Robert Motherwell always wanted to be an Asian painter, because of the Asian calligraphy. And I guess he saw some Asian stuff in my work, and that's why I won.
So, we always hesitate to talk and ask too much about one's connection to Asian imagery, iconography. It's come up a couple of times today because we're sensitive because someone is born in China but left as a young child, they may or may not have any interest that was continued as an adult, so you don't want to make assumptions. But do you see in your current work any evidence of your interest in
absolutely.
Asian culture? And if so, can you talk about that?
I would say my main influence, although I looked at almost everything from Japanese queens to a lot of Chinese painting, but I would say my main influence has been Hiroshige, who was documenting the daily life of town people in his famous Road to Edo. And it's basically a documentary of what ordinary people do, but at the same time, it has these large visions with landscape. And for me, he was able to document something that was real and at the same time give it some poetry and give it a space that's bigger than daily life. So I would say that would be my main influence is Hiroshige.
I also wanted to mention we were talking a little bit that there are many large container ships.
Yes.
Some of your paintings and what you might be thinking of with these large ships at port.
Well, you know, the Port of Oakland is very close by, and there are these large structures that remove the containers that this influenced Steven Spielberg or Lucas. Lucas thought that these things were animals. So I went to the port and photographed it. I've been there many times. And these ships are much larger than what you think, you know, when you're actually beside them. And they're always full of these container boxes. And going across the Bay Bridge, you see these container ships in the fog, which to me was like an Asian landscape painting. And what I was really interested in was how do I do this and capture a larger space? Because even though my atmospheres are vague, I wanted a bigger space. So I started putting these container ships in for that reason. I wasn't thinking so much about the global economy. You know, I was just thinking of expanding the space. And I felt to a large degree it kind of did that. And for some reason or other, I did quite a few of them, like 20 of these paintings. They were really exhilarating. It was really a great find. And it's really funny because at the same time, Chris Brown was painting railroad cars. And he was telling me the railroad car was similar to a container, you know, because it's transported goods. And that he felt that I found a great subject matter. And would I mind if he painted the same thing? And I said, no, not at all. And he said, you know, I could rent a boat and go out and photograph these things. But I don't think he ever did. I think it was in the back of his mind, and maybe he will in some time in the future.